You're rolling.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming out here, and welcome to RetroWorld Expo. Today's panel is entitled Game Literacy. This is a roundtable discussion that started down at MagFest in early 2017. We're going to cover a few different topics because game literacy is sort of a wide net. It describes a lot of different things. This is going to be a very open discussion, so we're going to have room for Q&A, but it's going to be primarily at the end, so if you have any questions, chew on them while we talk about this stuff, and then we're happy to field them. I know most of us, certainly the rest of the team will be here all weekend, so if you catch us down in the floor for the rest of the weekend, just grab an arm, ask some questions, more than happy to answer them. But first things first, some quick introductions. Starting here in my immediate right, your left, it's Leonard Herman.
Hi, I'm Leonard Herman. I'm the game scholar. In 1994, I wrote the very first history of video game book called Phoenix, The Fall and Rise of Home Video Games. And this year, I published a fourth edition of it called Phoenix 4, The History of the Video Game Industry, which is the most comprehensive history of video games ever written. So check it out at my table.
Hi, I'm Norman Caruso, and I do a documentary series on YouTube called The Gaming Historian. Been doing it for about 9 years now, coming up on the 10-year anniversary, so yeah, that's what I do, history of video games.
And I'm Daniel Greenberg. I'm a professor of game design at George Mason University down in Fairfax, Virginia. My focus is largely on transmediation with games and other forms of art. I also research the nascent field of game appreciation. I'm also the founder of Winterion Game Studios, based out of Clifton, Virginia. We produce the YouTube show Ion Gaming. All right, so we've got three sort of broken off segments that we'll talk for a few minutes each on. The first is going to kind of describe game literacy as a concept, because no two people have really the same idea in their head when they hear that term, necessarily what it means. The second topic, we'll get in a little bit about the importance of literacy and why, you know, even for something like video games, why there's value to it. And then the third one is sort of possible steps, ways you can envision or imagine kind of building game literacy as a concept. So let's just jump right into the first topic. Thoughts on game literacy. This one is one that I kind of love to throw to the panel first and then bounce back on, because I'm always curious when you hear the term game literacy, what kind of immediately springs to mind for you?
Okay, when you first pitched this to me, I was like, you mean like reading in games? Like, are you literate in games? But the more I thought about it, I was like, okay, well, I guess it's more of an understanding of games in general, or like what a game is, like design, development, history, culture, kind of everything surrounding a game. So, you know, there's film literacy, like you study film, there's music literacy, so game literacy obviously falls into that as well. But yeah, when you first hear it, I immediately went to like reading, so.
Well, as a historian, the first thing I thought of course, was the history of the video games, and literacy to me means the understanding of where it all came from. But like Norm says, there's a lot more involved. The culture, what the game's about, what's behind it, designers. So it encompasses a lot of stuff.
Yeah, in my case, I'm actually still not totally settled on the definition here. I kind of go between a couple things, and there may just be a lexicographical difference here about how you refer to them. When we talk about literacy in education, it's usually kind of from the, are you capable of consuming this at a specific, we always talk about reading like you read at a third grade level, fifth grade level, right? But we don't have really a game equivalent, like, you know, yeah, you kind of play like a rank 7 gamer or something, you know, it's not really a thing yet. But what we do have the ability to do is like, well, you can't really understand or like process the full element of this work if you are not capable of playing it. And we don't really have good metrics for that yet. I've tried to find parallels. The closest parallel we really have is like hardware literacy. Pearson Education does a good job of breaking down like what hardware is being used in schools at different ages and stuff. Most of our generation, we kind of had this benefit of playing PC games when we were younger, which, you know, no mom, I'm working on homework, totally. Yeah, it's homework, all tab. But we were developing keyboard and mouse skills unwittingly while we were playing games. Now there's a younger group of people in their early educational phase. They're getting a lot of hardware literacy with mobile phones and tablets because those are the things that are immediately available to them. And that's great for using those devices, but those are really consumer devices. They're not quite as useful a productivity device. So we're noticing an issue where like your ability to put together papers and do research and like your typing ability and words per minute and all that stuff. We've been rising as computers have been getting into schools, but now that you're seeing the mobile and tablet thing, it's actually kind of plateauing, dropping off a little bit. And so there is some idea that there is a literacy and ability to consume games the way you would have any other medium and how you develop that. And then the other side to it, which you mentioned with the historical end, is, and I think that wanders a little more into appreciation. Do you understand specific eras? What do we mean by like an early era shmup? What would you describe as, like, we refer to like generations for consoles. It's the same idea, the ability to kind of categorize and maneuver these things into ways that we can talk about them in kind of a larger scope, which I think that part has been very well done, especially like at the community level with videos and books and all the stuff that's been done by enthusiasts to kind of get us to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember me going, when I went to school, we had a computer lab and we would go every week and we would play a typing game and we would learn how to type and we would put on a little blindfold and, okay, how many words can you type per minute? And actually my brother-in-law runs a charter school and they don't have a computer lab. They just hand out iPads and stuff. So you're absolutely right in that, typing, you have to, if you want to make a game, you have to use a keyboard and code it. So, it's, you're absolutely right about the whole iPad thing. It's a consumer product. So,
but my question is, the literacy in games, does that mean you're going to learn something from it? Because then what breaks the line between an educational game and a game just for fun?
Well, not to segue to my talk tomorrow on serious games here at 1 o'clock, but
he paid me to say that.
I might have. What you get out of the work is sort of the second step, and I guess that gets more to the appreciation and the critique side. Literacy is kind of the ability to consume it. So whether it's an educational game or whether it's a training, a vocational thing, a simulator, something you buy commercially for fun, whatever the work is, literacy usually is defined as sort of that ability to consume the work, to be able to play it, to be able to experience it, and then to understand what it is you are playing or experiencing. Because you might be able to read words in a book, but if you can't process the sentences and make structural understanding of what you're consuming, you're just kind of repeating out loud.
Yeah.
So literacy usually has some element of comprehension. It's that reading comprehension, same idea, right? It's all kind of in that same sphere.
Well, it's also, there's also the fact that the video game industry is relatively young compared to the music industry and the film industry, and so those two sectors, they have that type of those studies. I mean, you can get your degree in film studies and stuff. So, with video games, I feel like you said, the community is really helping with that. But it would be nice if we got more into the educational realm of video game culture.
No, it's slowly happening.
It is, yeah, and because there's some old movies I've watched, and like, this is a classic movie. You have to watch this movie, and I'll watch it. I'm like, I don't get it. I don't understand why this is a good movie. So that's like, maybe I'm not film literate. Like, I don't understand what makes that a good movie. So it's the same thing with games. Maybe people don't understand why. Like, I have fun playing Super Mario Brothers, but maybe I don't understand why Super Mario Brothers is a good game.
And there's a tricky thing, and I have common misconceptions laid here because I want to kind of state this up front. There is generally a difference between being literate at something and being good at something. And it's a tricky line to walk because games, unlike most other forms of medium, they require you to, in a lot of cases, reach a certain point of skill to finish consuming a work. We spent time practicing like Ninja Gaiden to be able to beat Ninja Gaiden, to then be able to show you Ninja Gaiden in episodes and then talk about it in a review. And you can get a good sense of a game by being able to play it up to a certain point, but there are gates, and there are gates there in a way that really almost no other form has. You don't read books where the complexity of the language increases from chapter to chapter. You know, there is no sort of the journey of sesquipedalianism where you are starting with hop on pop, and by the end of the book, you are thesaurusing every third word. Although this idea suddenly sounds really compelling, and I'm kind of eager to try it, but
it gets more difficult as you read it.
Yeah, but we don't grant things like that. We don't tend to gate things like that. You're either, you know, you can or you can't generally. It's fairly binary in a lot of other forms. In games, we have this unique, you know, interactivity, and with that interactivity comes pass-fail, you know. Assassin's Creed has now been talking about the idea that they're going to have sort of a tourist mode in their games because a lot of instructors want to use their games as like, let me show you what the art and architecture of...
Yes, that new one that takes place in Egypt.
Right.
Yeah.
And
which I want to stream that. That'd be so much fun.
Yeah. And that's compelling, but it's interesting because it throws a wrench in the whole, you know, what's the difference between being literate and being sort of qualified or skilled in something. And I think it's important that distinction exists in that, not just because it's a healthy thing to do necessarily, but because if you are capable of consuming it at some level, right, if you can get something out of it, it's like being able to go to an opera and appreciate it, but maybe because it's in a foreign language, or maybe because it's your first time going to the opera, you don't necessarily get some of the deeper, oh, well, that's why Verdi wrote it that way, because there's a specific angle that he's approaching that, and it's a little self-referential, and I'm not that engrossed in the sphere yet to really understand what they're doing, but
yeah.
You're still getting something out of it. There's still some meaningful experience.
Yeah. You're absolutely right about the skill, because I'm sure you could ask the top Call of Duty player in the world about video games, and I bet he probably wouldn't know a lot about the older retro games. I mean, because they kind of focus in on just getting really good at that game.
Sure. And the other things we have, as you know, like 50 plus years of history in this sphere now, and there are so many different genres, so many different ways to experience this thing, that you have, say, people who are like horror movie specialists. All of a sudden you have people who are, it's not that they know video games, it's that they are really proficient in point-and-click adventures. They are very aware of how the specific, like, pre-16-bit platforming, like they can tell you the exact number of frames of grace period before you can jump like off the edge of a thing, and you know.
Yeah.
It's very granular.
Yeah, and it's growing because, you know, as more games get made, those genres get bigger and bigger, and then you need more people to become experts in that genre.
We need all of you up here at one point.
Yeah.
Can we move on?
Sure.
All right, so the second of our three topics is why literacy matters. I'm going to start this off with a quick explanation of these three terms because I think it's important going forward. As I mentioned, when we talk about game literacy, the idea is that you have the ability to consume the work, that you have some fundamental understanding that permits you access to the medium. Appreciation can be thought of as the ability to catalog and communicate the language, you know, that you now know. Who here's taken an art appreciation course in school of some kind? You know, fair number of you. And art appreciation courses don't task you with necessarily demonstrating the ability to reproduce what you're seeing. What art appreciation courses really do is give you an understanding of what different periods were and how art has changed and how people learned from each other and it grew, and you understand, you know, where specific forms came from, you know, cuneiforms and bas reliefs and onto impressionism, post-impressionism, cubism, realism. You know, you understand these spheres, and it gives you the ability then, if you are to say go into a museum or an art gallery or something and you get to see these works and you really kind of have a better understanding of them because you've consumed this. Game appreciation is something that exists primarily in these talks and in a couple Word documents that I have, because right now the notion of doing that exists only in the minds of the people who are doing this at the ground level, people who are making, like, here's my website dedicated to shmups, or hey, I'm a huge fan of like the Sega SG-1000. I've completely cataloged like all the games and I have a long play of every one of them. Come check out my site. And that's really useful to have, but there's no kind of overarching language describing that. And that gets us to critique, because typically we tend to skip over the first ones and get to the third pretty quickly. We have a challenge right now where there's a big debate in the community about how we review games and who's reviewing games and how those games are being reviewed. And it's not really settled science yet, because you have people reviewing games who have the ability to consume it at varying levels, and you get varying levels of review out of that, and it's still largely a commercial sphere. Most reviews you go and find are going to be like, decent game, controls a bit laggy, 8 out of 10. And that may be useful from the consumer standpoint of, do I want to pick this up or not? But we're not really getting post hoc analysis or the kind of things you would get from, say, a review of a theater production of something,
right,
where it's really kind of breaking down all the elements of things and saying what worked and what didn't. We're not getting that until much, much later when this community is kind of doing that post hoc. You're not getting that at the front end, right? When there's a premiere, an opening night of something, that stuff's already in the city paper. When you're getting a premiere or an opening night of a thing, it's a few commercial websites telling you whether or not you want to buy the game.
Yeah. This actually makes me think of the recent IGN review of Star Fox 2. I don't know if you read that.
I've heard of, have not. There's been a few that I've kind of been told like I need to read, but
well, it's kind of a problem like you were talking about with the reviews, where Star Fox 2 has finally officially been released by Nintendo, and IGN reviewed it like a modern game, and you can't do that,
right,
because when Star Fox 2 came out, it was, well, if it did come out in 94 or 95, it would have been a stellar Super Nintendo game, but they reviewed it like it should have come out on PS4, and of course it's not gonna, that game coming out on PS4, it wouldn't have been that great. You gotta kind of get in the time frame of when that game would come
it's the
out.
punishment of hindsight instead of the benefit in this case,
Yeah.
My problem with reviews, though, is because you're depending on one person's outlook on something, and it's one reason why I never review games. Personally, I don't like fighting games, so it could be the best fighting game in the world. I'm not going to give it a good review because I don't like those. So it's all up to the reviewer. And a lot of these reviewers, a lot of these kids who have their own sites and stuff, they're just doing it because they want to get more free stuff from the companies. So they're always going to give it a good review, and you can't depend on any of that.
Right. And I think this kind of circles into the last little bit of this. It's the challenges of absence, the real benefits of having it, sort of the pros and cons of this. Once this language starts to exist, once you have the ability to describe a work relative to other works of its time and place, it becomes a lot easier to do reviews that escape sort of the base commercial element of the review. If I am to describe certain elements of, and I'll just use it because it's my thesis and it's the most recent thing in my mind, Final Fantasy VI, and I want to describe the different narrative elements at work, and I can explain that, well, the specific formulation that they use in the opera is sort of harkens back to Tosca, and that Maria Callas's Tosca is similar to Cella Scher's Maria. And there's a specific strife and a parallel between Palazzo and Baron Scarpia, and we see sort of commonalities in their struggles against forces that they have no, individual power to defeat. And that's really cool and useful if you happen to know all those references. If you don't, you end up staring blank-eyed at the page. So the trick is to find game language, like exclusively game language, because transmediation does permit us the ability to kind of do parallels and overlaps, and it's really useful as a foundation to start writing this stuff. But you've got to have your own lexicon at some point. You have to be able to describe these works against other works that they are peers to, necessarily.
But you're talking about an industry that still can't decide if video games is one word, 2 words, or hyphenated.
At some point, Rogitz, Oxford, Merriam-Webster, someone's going to have to come here. We're just going to have to start hammering some of this stuff out, because there has to be a commonality of language, right?
There's a very adamant group of people that feel it is 2 words. Video games.
I go with 1 word.
Yeah, see, there you go.
And I can't say I've ever had a preference necessarily, but all of a sudden I feel like I absolutely should. All right, so...
But the worst is when you read an article and they use all 3 in the same article.
Yeah. At that point, the editors. So let's jump to the third of these 3, because I want to make sure we leave plenty of time, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of questions on the subject. And the third is steps for building it. So under the pretense that we have this idea that we can communicate the concept of games and the ability to consume them, ways to build this. Availability is sort of just how do you get this stuff in the hands of people who are interested in learning what it is and learning to grow from it. And I think we're doing a fairly good job of that part. Games now are available on all sorts of platforms for for the most part, with like limited exception, this stuff's available fairly inexpensively. And even for the stuff that is expensive, and I'm sure there are some really nice high quality items downstairs that the vendors would love you to drop 3 digits on. There are plenty of terrific reviews and Let's Plays and long plays and sort of breakdowns of those, and streamers probably playing them right now, that allow you to experience and understand the work, which can give you some better consumption. And those works, those things like LPs, help cross that barrier of ability. Like, let's say I don't have it in me to master the Xbox era Ninja Gaiden games.
That's fair.
Right? And so I'm going to watch someone who has gone through that diligent effort to do so, do it, and by watching them, you get a better understanding of like, oh, well, this is sort of the work as its whole, and okay, so I see there's sort of, it's a timing mechanism, but the timing windows are shrinking over the course of it, and that's kind of where the difficulty ramp comes from. Or the way that they communicate things through like boss signaling kind of decreases, or it becomes more of like less memorization and more of like pattern recognition or something. You can witness sort of the development and growth of a title that way. And that's because we have people that are kind of diligently making this happen. What we don't really have is a reading list. We don't have a welcome to video games. We're so glad you've decided to join us. Have a seat. You know, here's a copy of Pong.
Yeah.
And it may be time to start mulling over what a reading list looks like for games, because a reading list is an extremely effective way to start somebody with something that you know that you've curated as this is an excellent starting point for you to understand interactivity with the television or the screen or something. And now okay, now you're good with this. Now let's introduce you to a platformer, or let's introduce you to, you know, a multiplayer game or something.
Yeah, and you have a lot of like top 100 games of all time, but that's different from like a reading list.
And again, it's someone's personal opinion of what it is. So.
Right.
Right. In this case, what the benefit of a reading list provides you is if you want to wean somebody into something, if you are interested in showing them, well, like, I really love this genre. I know you never heard of shmup. It's like shoot 'em up. It's like you fly a little ship and you shoot. It's a lot of fun. Please don't look at my screen. I'm playing Toho right now. There's a million bullets everywhere. I don't want to scare you. Like, look, here is Space Invaders. It's great. It's fun. Get comfortable with it. Experience it. Kind of understand what makes this compelling, and we'll move from there. We take, I think, for granted the idea that a lot of us grew up with the medium, and we are now running into second and third generation where I have students in my class who I ask, like, what's the first game you played? And it came out in the 21st century. And you get used to that eventually, right? But you have to understand that we had the benefit, for the most part, of growing up with the medium. So as we were younger players and slowly got more skilled and more competent in this stuff, the games were getting more complicated, and we were charting that ramp just by sort of the cosmic benevolence of being in the right place at the right time, temporally. And now, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, well, we have, you know, younger people coming into this medium, and the controllers we're handing them to start playing have 16 to 20 buttons. And the games we're starting them out on have 40 on 40 multiplayer. And there's so much going on, and they still develop these skills, but these skills become very specific to the experience they have. And I think the benefit of having something like a reading list is you're not going to intimidate somebody if you know the right thing to show them first or second. And you can bring people into this. And then when you go to explain something to them later, when you go to say, like, oh, now I understand why this, like, selecting different grades of weapons in Winterion is so interesting, because I've played previous shmups and I realize now that, like, oh, this was a really innovative thing for its time.
Yeah.
But you need people who are interested in something like that to go with the reading list. Like, my kids will not watch a movie that's in black and white.
Right.
Or they listen to rap. They won't listen to 60s music or 70s music. So you have to have some kind of appreciation to go backwards in the first place.
I feel like especially would help out when developing a game if you have a good understanding of, like, if, say you're developing a shmup and you have an understanding of past shmups, you know what works for you and what doesn't, you know, what people would want in that genre.
Right, and obviously I have a kind of a cop out there. I can just assign it to him as homework. But
There you go.
there's other things that we can do besides developing a reading list that kind of help out here. We have curation and preservation. There are people that are doing bang up work that deserves some recognition. Shout outs to people like Frank Cifaldi in the Video Game History Foundation that are trying to find prior art and record it and save it, make this stuff available. The Strong Museum down up in New York, Rochester. And then there's also the Video Game History Museum down in Frisco, Texas.
The National Video Game
National
Museum.
Video, right.
Which I'm an advisor to.
Oh, well, it's great. I was actually down there when I visited the Let's Play Gaming Expo, I think the year before last. And so there are people who are doing, yeoman work, making sure this stuff's available and presenting it in this exhibit format that it can be kind of better understood and kind of seen, especially the one down in Texas, the fact that they have like the video game store as it looked in '83 with like all the Atari games in the dollar bin, like.
And the wood paneling. On
Right.
The wall.
Well, when I went there, Joe Santulli, one of the organizers, says, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, it's like going in my basement. I have all this stuff."
Yeah.
So, and I mean, it's really useful stuff to have, and the fact that people are doing this is terrific. And I encourage, if you are interested in any of this stuff, like go there, check it out. I'm always trying to be kind of a big booster for the people that are doing the historical preservation.
I mean, not trying to promote us, but don't forget the work that me and Norm do too, which
Okay.
is really important. Again, my book features everything you want to know, and Norm presents it on the screen.
I've cited Phoenix 2 in more than one paper that I wrote, and I think 4 is on the way from Amazon, so.
Yeah, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to the game.
Yes, and you joke, but that's seriously, that's the thing. Like, there are thousands of people on YouTube of all sizes, like large and small, who are doing this work in aggregate, that are commenting and understanding and like growing to. I've watched channels play games I've never heard of on systems that I only knew existed, and gone, wait, that came out in '89? Like, that's great. I didn't realize there was something that complicated like for that system. Or when I was at AVGC just recently, they had a Super Cassette Vision set up, and I'd never played one before. And I'm playing a shmup on it that is so insanely like light speed fast and crazy. I'm like, I can't believe this came out when this came out, because I didn't play anything in the arcade that was quite that, rapid at that point. So
I think one of the, as far as like appreciation goes, when I do my research, the one episode I always think of is when I did my episode on the Power Glove. And it's easy to dismiss the Power Glove because, you play it and it's like, well, this thing sucks. And the game sucked for it, and they just throw it away. But when I was talking with the people that made it and what they were trying to do, you get an appreciation for what they were trying to do, and you understand why the Power Glove didn't work. And you see that Super Glove Ball actually was pretty decent because it did work with the Power Glove. So, yeah, when you get into the history of some of these devices and games, you do get more of an appreciation for them.
any thoughts before we move on? All right. So the last thing I want to mention before we go to Q&A is this idea of kind of assigned gaming and patterns for education. So as I mentioned, once you start understanding what it is like people are looking for, and you can curate reading lists, and you can develop a way to kind of educate people on how to consume video games so that they become informed enough to be kind of fully versed in what they're doing. The question then becomes, how does education take advantage of this? And a lot of this is going to be talked about tomorrow, but it's what can you get out of like the work, understanding yourself, as the instructor in this case. What can you do to provide some information that allows people to kind of read and understand this stuff? How do you present it to them? Oftentimes that's going to be through word of mouth, it's going to be through talking with them, sometimes it can be written, tweeting, emailing, whatever. But then there's also the question of like just experiencing it, because the experiential part of games is so critical. And whether you are sitting there playing it on the couch with somebody or for somebody, or watching it together online, or playing against each other, across the digital divide, whatever it is, even small shifts like that go a long way to changing the educational experience for somebody and how they consume a work. And it's important to kind of like realize how those differences exist. And it's nice that we're starting to break those walls down. The live streaming thing is doing a great job of kind of taking that digital separation and narrowing the time between interactivity and being able to explain stuff. You know, when you're playing Super Mario RPG and your ability to kind of talk through things that were happening, you know, as the game's going on makes a huge difference.
It's amazing, like some of the games that I'll play on Twitch and the amount of people that are like, oh, I've never heard of this game, I've never played this, I want to go check it out now. So yeah, Twitch plays a huge role in that.
So people get interested in games because I force them to become interested in games. They watch you play games and go like, I wonder what else is in that genre. They grab your book and understand what was going on in that period, and everybody's happy.
Yeah, circle of life.
Perfect. All right, and with that, we have plenty of time here. I wanted to make sure to leave a lot for Q&A because, like I said, this is kind of a broad idea, game literacy, and there's a lot of potential elements to it. So I wanted to make sure you have plenty of time, so questions.
You touched on it a little bit, but I was curious, to what extent can we use game literacy towards other spheres of academia? It seems like you were talking about the professor that wanted to look at architecture and things like that. It seems like there's a lot of room to, I don't know, discuss The Legend of Zelda in context of Campbell's Hero's Quest, or you know, even put games in a historical context. And I was just wondering if that's something you see happening in your field.
So to repeat, the question was using games sort of in this educational context. Absolutely. Obviously, like the most common example here is like, oh, well, they sell Minecraft Educational Edition, and that's nice. But there are lots of pursuits to that in all sorts of different directions. But there's two kind of split-offs there. It's, are you consuming the game so that you can then discuss it in another format? That is to say, like, you mentioned, you know, we could take The Legend of Zelda and deconstruct it and talk about Hero's Journey and, like, you know, Return with the Elixir and all these steps involved and where those parallels exist. And we do that a lot. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a demonstration of transmediation. It's just using the language that we get from film and video studies or from English to then communicate and understand the game. And that's great. We use that pattern a lot in our game design classes at Mason. We can take the story of Cinderella or the story of Star Wars, and then they can start to see the parallels in narrative structure to games. But the flip side of that, games that themselves instruct or educate in some particular sphere, that tends to wander what we call serious games. Generally, the design pattern there is you are making a work with a specific person, goal in mind. It may be vocational, it may be training related, it may be educational, it may be for awareness. There are lots of different groups that do this. The best thing I can say is I've got an hour of thoughts on the subject tomorrow. But serious games themselves are definitely like an emergent field. There's a lot of interest in them, especially down in Washington, D.C. where I am. Like government contractors interested in using this for training. The military obviously uses this a lot. And schools are no different. Schools are thrilled to have interactive software because interactivity in that software like gets attention the way that very little else does. Like in the classroom, it's a terrific attention grabber. But then, does the work necessarily hold on to somebody? There was a book written by Clark Abt in 1970 called Serious Games. It was kind of like the touchstone work on the genre. And his findings are excellent. It's largely based around understanding that the mechanic has to be responsible for demonstrating the lesson, because you can make War of 1812 Monopoly, but if you play it, you're not learning really about the War of 1812. You might memorize a couple turns. You're learning how to play Monopoly, right? And the way to get around that complication is mostly from that.
I knew, I read an article about a history teacher that would use, there's a PC strategy game called Hearts of Iron, you know, World War II simulation, and he used that in his history classroom, and like it would give the students an understanding of like, okay, this is like the resources that, you know, Nazi Germany had in Japan, and because in the game you get to choose a country, you fight through World War II, and he would use that game to give his students an understanding of World War II and what the entire world was going through at the time.
And that's kind of the last element of this really before we go on, is if you know a work that can provide the information, if it exists, that's kind of where the appreciation thing comes in. If you know that Sid Meier's Civilization does a good job of demonstrating the importance of early civilizations being founded near rivers because of the agricultural benefits that came from that, you can demonstrate that easily enough by someone playing Civ and picking up like, oh, I keep losing because I keep building my first town in Tundra. And it's right, and so because you have the ability to do that, and just demonstrating it through mechanic, it illuminates those things. So a well-constructed title will do that. Now, obviously, you have two options in that sense. You either make a well-constructed title yourself if you're a developer and you want to make a game to teach a certain topic, or B, you find a game that exists that does a good job there, and that comes back more to the reading list and being able to identify a game that's going to teach the lesson in question. Speaking of, next question.
So I want to take it back for a second. You were talking about levels of literacy. I mean, you take someone with like reading levels, for instance. You have somebody who has, like a very low academic reading level, and somebody who has read literally everything. You hand them both a copy of Tolstoy. The first guy's like, "Where's Hop on Pop?" The other guy calls it, elementary dribble. With gaming, if you take someone who has no literacy and take someone who has, the highest level of literacy you can really achieve right now, and give them a brand new game, obviously the first guy's not going to have like, what the hell are hit points? And when do I lose them when that guy touches me? What does it look like to have like really high literacy? If somebody's kind of at the top of that spectrum, like, and they pick up a brand new game, what does their general experience look like?
Okay, so question is kind of the difference in being able to process a work between like a neophyte and somebody who's really, really experienced, be that in games writ large or for a specific genre. When we have a red bar over somebody's head in a game, what does that usually mean? Health, right? We just kind of represent it, it's a generic thing for health. We know that because it's a common design pattern, and those common design patterns are very, very common, and a lot of games use them. Some games wander off the reservation a little bit, but for the most part, because we understand we have a certain level of literacy in it, we're able to kind of pick that apart. The difference is usually in design, time, and sort of difficulty ramp. So if you produce a work that is sufficiently easy to adopt and understanding in, that is to say the control scheme is really good, it's forgiving at first and gets more challenging later, it does the right sort of things in training the player to experience it, and it can carry them through that work and they develop it along the way. There may be a very small difference between an extremely experienced player and a first-time player. The only difference might be that the experienced player knows he's got to go looking to 100% the thing, or he's trying to beat it in under an hour. But they may get very similar experiences of that game in the long run. Whereas another title that's developed with a very high complexity level because it has a certain audience in mind. Think about games that are made E for everyone versus T for teen versus M for mature. They've already made a decision based on what they think their player coming in will necessarily have, because time dictates, well, they've only had at best maybe 5 years to play this before they get to this level anyway. So you kind of know to an extent a little bit about your audience when you go in to make a title. And you may be surprised later on that different groups necessarily adopt it, but as designers of games, you go in with that idea. Whether a specific work is given to people, that goes back to our reading list idea. That goes back to knowing what work is necessarily like right to, whether like a really good player or like a really new player, what's best to give them. And obviously in the case of like War and Peace, yes. War and Peace is not something we assign in second grade. We assign it generally in like late middle school or in high school, because there are demands of that work that prior stuff makes more sense to explain. I guess the same way we probably wouldn't assign the Xbox Ninja Gaiden at least before someone got some other experience in over-the-shoulder platformers.
Yeah, especially actually speaking of platform, I think one of the common things that maybe a more experienced player would know is that there's a jump button. Most platformers, there's a jump button, and I remember playing with like my sister in Super Mario, and she just like ran off the edge, and she didn't know there's a jump button. So I think that's another thing that can come up with an inexperienced player versus a more experienced one.
When I first got an NES in the 80s, and I was playing Super Mario Brothers, I had a friend who would come over, and he would grab the NES zapper. It wasn't plugged in. I'd be playing Mario, and he would just be there clicking the zapper, and he was the happiest kid in the world. He had no earthly idea, he had no contribution to this whatsoever, but in some sort of unique way, he was still kind of getting something out of this work. He was still kind of along for the ride and experiencing it, and for him it was just Wild West, and he was shooting the Goombas, and they were going, boo! It had nothing to do with the guy running across the screen. He was the happiest kid in the world. So yeah, literacy is kind of a unique thing, and there's more than one way, I guess, to get something out of a game.
Yeah.
Well, one thing Ralph Baer always complained about with the Odyssey that people didn't realize was there was an English button. So when the ball's going like this, you press the button, and it will just, off its path, which Pong didn't do.
Right.
And he says that was a strategic part of the Odyssey, but nobody realized it was there.
Was that in the later ones, like the clones, like the 3000 stuff? Did they also have that, or was it just in the?
Maybe 100 and 200 did. I don't think the later ones after that did.
Yeah, because I know we snagged a copy of, I think, the 3000 in the studio, and that thing's addictive. So, okay, next question. Yes. Sure.
So I was wondering where you think the line is between full-on literacy and interpersonal or intertextual understanding, between where like a kind of a feeling or something you want to convey goes between learning about it and also just kind of connecting with it. For example, Kenji and this game, I've talked about it a little bit, but D is just to bring someone to a narrative. Enemy Zero is to connect fear in a way that's not done commonly in game. There's enemies invisible. So piano chimes you hear in the middle is like next to you, high pitches above you. So you associate that sound and that response to that sound to a certain emotion. And that can connect to a person, that connect to another person playing the game or sitting next to them. And that is brought further with real sound, which is in Japan, which is like a blind person's visual novel, there's no visuals.
Right.
And that was probably, or pretty much designed to make people empathize and feel a way and sense a sensation that they can't. So when you find that kind of broadcasting and teaching in the same way as literacy, or we find that more in terms of interpersonal or emotional nuance?
So the question is largely about sort of the literacy and ability to consume versus sort of the larger textual or thematic things that come out of it. And I tend to go transmedial when I think about these things, but the first thing I think is how your book reports change when you're a young kid and as you get older, and the things that are expected of you in your book reports. When I first wrote book reports in school, it was I need to be able to identify the main character, the villain, roughly what the story is and whether I liked it or not. And it went from there throughout the years, and eventually, you start talking about theme, and you start talking about certain design choices or certain language that was used and why it was used. And the depth of your discussion gets deeper the more ability you have to this. So I guess I would say sort of what you're describing is actually a pretty good dividing line between literacy and appreciation. It's where those start to meld. It's the point at which now that I can consume the work and I can pick out these little details, and I realize that these design decisions are not accidental, that yes, the specific choice of the tones that are being used in the alert for the piano are specific to convey additional information, but also serve as a way to influence you emotionally in that moment. And because you're able to kind of parse that out and recognize that as something other than just a rote signal for a behavior in a game, that's kind of where it starts to wander into the realm of appreciation, because you understand it vis-a-vis other stuff. It's not just like, oh, well, lots of games have pings, right, to let you know something, and lots of games have mini-maps or radars, whatever they do. And this time the game has chosen sort of a very exciting but cinematic and in the same way like instantly communicable way by which to demonstrate, in this case, three-dimensional information, which is really exciting. And that stuff is not very common. It then kind of falls on us to go and find those things and explain them, because if someone has put out the video explaining like this is why they did these things in this way, and somebody else finds it, all of a sudden their eyes are open to that and they can identify that in other works, and they may pick out something in a game they played 20 years prior and go, wow, that's incredible. And that can be really exciting because that can create all new enthusiasm for literacy writ large. Any thoughts? I agree.
Me too.
Nice.
You said it very nicely. That's nothing to add.
That's what I did. All right, so we probably have time for one more question. Yeah.
I'm actually interested in this idea of the reading list, and I'm wondering if it's just one overarching reading list, much in the way that we would develop, the game literacy as film and art has. Because, as an educator, I am interested in developing I would be interested in developing game literacy among girls and women. That's one target that I would have. And another would be to create a reading list that would help students use gaming and gaming literacy to develop more social and interconnection ability. Because I think that there's sort of like a cooperative social behavioral element in gaming that, I think many of my students could honestly take really good advantage of. So.
Oh, definitely. So this is the idea, like how to go about this process. First off, you've already done the most important thing. You identified what you want to do in this case. You have two very clear goals in mind, right? It's developing this list for students and specifically like to bring young girls and women like into the sphere and understanding what you're looking for. And then you can start to go from there and develop it. I know Fujio Matsuji, MTJ, before he decided to stop making games and went into games education, he's got a great line there was like a Taito Legends series for the PlayStation, and he put a video in one of them where he said, I would rather plant a lot of trees than be a tree. He was expressing that he wanted to be someone for whom like he could express his world and like get it out and get people involved. But he always had that philosophy. Bubble Bobble was largely designed because he wanted to try to democratize the arcade a little bit. He wanted to bring more, girlfriends and women and couples like to come in and play the game. It's why you had to play a two-player for the best ending. Yeah. It's why the themes were set up the way they were, and why the game was as colorful as it was, and why that 40-second loop will be burned into my brain for the rest of eternity. But that when you have game literacy and appreciation, and when you can identify these things and not just that they may necessarily fit for the purpose, but that they were actually tailored for the purpose, all of a sudden it becomes really exciting. You can start to find commonalities in these games. And all of a sudden a reading list of one thing can become 5 things, can become 15 things, of various difficulty levels, of various complexities that can then like, oh, I just found like the perfect entry level thing, and then like these 3 things can follow it, and then like for the people that are really into it, all of a sudden there's like a dozen things available that fit this specific mold.
Yeah, I think everyone's, especially that specific reading list, would be unique and something that would evolve over time. Yeah.
So I'd say, yeah, absolutely. The first step is knowing what you're looking for, and you've already got that. The second step is then finding things that fit or match your specific target, and then identifying the other elements in there that may need to cause you to kind of shuffle or reorganize, like do I start with game 1, game 5, game 7, whatever they are. You may also find that not all games are best communicated through playing them. I've had students where I've been like, well, I'd like you to try to play something. And then they go to the internet arcade and play it. And it's an emulated thing that they're playing on a keyboard in a completely different environment, a different thing, and they get a very different experience than the arcade experience would have given them, or that the PC experience of the time would have given them. Even just for something as simple as loading times or the frame rate of the game, these can have drastic impacts on your overall experience because you're moving farther away from authorial intent. And the farther you get away from that, the harder it is to use that game as a specific artifact because you're not going to get the same experience. Or worse, if you're telling other people to try to do that and they may not get the same experience, and then you as someone who's trying to be, say, like an educator who's setting up like a list for an entire department or a list for like a school system, and they're looking at your thing and they're consuming it elsewhere and go, why are we having this do this? The game, it doesn't work, this doesn't fly. So there's always immeasurable factors that count there, and sometimes maybe the best thing is to watch a video of somebody playing it. Sometimes the best thing is to sit in while somebody's playing it. Might be the best thing is for you to play it in class and do a live LP and talk about the game while you're playing it and have the students provide feedback and say like, well, why'd they do this? Or, you can have all sorts of patterns here. Not every time is the best one going to be, I want you to go home and play this. It's the easiest for us as homework to assign it that way, but there's going to be a lot of different patterns by which, and it's, I guess, not only do you have to find out what's to be used, but the best way to use it in any given case. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. And with that, we are out of time. So first, thank you all so much for coming out here. Greatly appreciated. Leonard and Norm, thank you so much for sitting on and being part of this.
Welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And have an excellent weekend here at RetroWorld.